Yes, ladies and gentlemen, with the risk, of course, of repeating what has already been told during previous lectures, but it's still very important that what we do nowadays within the choral world is part of a tradition which started thousands of years ago. And that specifically with regard to what we now call chamber choirs, everything which was sung even from the first days of our era is by an ensemble of mostly what we would call nowadays a chamber choir, a small group between 12 and maybe 20 singers. And that small group, sometimes even smaller, 5, 6, 7, 8 as a vocal ensemble, these kind of groups went on very long during history, way into the 19th century. And then there was a short period that mainly large chorales were preferred above chamber choirs. The bourgeoisie loved to have the great choirs and thought that those smallish ones were mainly because of lack of money or because the composers didn't get as far as vocal attention what they wanted in reality. But in the 20th century, we found that, of course, the history is a little bit different and that Bach, even if he would have liked a large choir, then still a large choir for him would be 24 to 40 singers and not 80 or 100. But of course, in the 18th century, mainly in the British territory, they loved to have huge choirs, mostly for one single piece, the Messiah by Handel. And then they would have 500 on a location just for such a performance. These kind of exceptions give us quite easily the idea as if large choirs were always the goal, but they were not. Large choirs were, until the beginning of the 19th century, the exception. In the 19th century, though, it changed in that way that most in Europe, and specifically in Central Europe, choirs were a kind of a substitute for political meetings. We do tend to forget that even here in Ireland or in England or in Scandinavia, the 19th century was an age of restoration. And during that restoration, the secret polices everywhere, or people who controlled the ordinary bourgeoisie, were extremely afraid for gatherings of more than 3 people, which meant that if you want to gather together, you had to find a reason. And what better reason to be found than art? Let's come together for poetry. Let's come together to sing. Let's come together to play a theater piece. So you see that these kind of societies are founded from the 1815 on, after the Congress of Vienna, everywhere in Europe, as partly a social event, gathering, being together, singing together. What isn't nicer than to sing together? It's one of the most physical things you can do in art is singing together. And when it fits, it's a great joy. But they came also together for political reasons. So you see that there are choirs which belong to the firemen, to the coal workers, to the police, to all kinds of official groups. They gather together and they discuss during coffee breaks or any moment possible what to do with the government, what to do with the positions, how to fight for the social securities, etc., etc. And that went on more or less everywhere in Europe until the Second World War. Then suddenly it stopped for several reasons. Probably because in most countries social laws were erected in such a way that people were more or less happy with what they got. Probably because they got all the possibilities to vote into the politics themselves, so they were not outsiders anymore, but they were part of the system of democracy themselves. So then, when they gathered, it was mainly because they wanted to sing together. And even in the 1950s and 60s, when I was young, we had in the Netherlands still, every day on the radio in the morning, the Socialist Radio Choir. And they would sing some beautiful socialist songs, and then there was some kukeleku, and then the day would start with bright sunlight, etc. That stopped altogether in the late 1960s. So what you see now, and that is something which is everywhere in Europe, people come together to sing really because of the music. And luckily, I can say Now, looking backwards over those last hundreds of years, at this proper moment in Europe, and we take Europe more or less from Moscow to Iceland, that in that enormous area of Europe, there are between 35 and 37 million people singing weekly in a choir, which means that there are approximately 1 million choirs in Europe. They need conductors. Even if a conductor would take 2 or 3, it means that we are talking about 300,000 to 400,000 conductors. Most of them are not educated to do so. There are singers who love to sway their arms a little bit and to get things more or less straight. They are not trained in professional education of singers. And to educate a professional singer is not that hard as to educate an amateur singer. If you make a mistake there, you have a lousy choir. So there is a lot of work to do, and there is still a lot we need to do. But the fact that not that long ago, Secretary of Art of Culture in Austria, in the House of Parliament, said, "Ladies and gentlemen, remember, there are at this proper moment more people singing in a choir in Austria than playing football." Which gives you an idea, why should we give subvention so much to football and so little to the choirs or to music in general? So we see a change. In order to explain that, I have to go a little bit back. In the 19th century, when all those huge choirs popped up everywhere, there was another tendency also, an evolution in the arts, which is part of our lives nowadays. And in fact, it overwhelms most of what we hear on the radio, and that is the past. Music from past times. Mozart virtually never listened to music from past times. And if it were past times, then he would go back to Bach, if it were ever performed in his days, which was not that often. He would go either to Rome or to Bologna to hear church choirs perform some beautiful pieces from the 17th or the early 18th century, but that was the past. 95% of all the repertoire he heard everywhere in Europe where he traveled with his father, his mother and his sister was contemporary music. It was the music of the day. And the duty of composers until late in the 19th century was to write as much music as possible for the audiences then. The idea that composers were writing for a future is a ridiculous invention of later times in order to explain why, for example, Beethoven's string quartet were so difficult. Because he wrote them for the future. Well, I fear that if someone would have told Beethoven, he would have laughed his heart out. But anyway, in reality, up till the beginning of the 20th century, most of the repertoire, with all the orchestras, with all the choirs, with all the concert halls, was contemporary music. If you compare that with what we're doing now, you see how large the differences are. We listen mostly to old music, and we not always like contemporary music, although more than we think, because we are afraid of tasting it. So it is always a question of the unknown. But it is important to realize, in the 19th century, for the first time, the bourgeoisie became aware of a past. And the past in music meant, what was before Bach? What was before Mozart? Was there any music? What did we, bourgeoisie, develop in the past? The aristocracy never composed. They had their composers in their service. But they could say, look at the wall in my castle, all those people, that's my family, all the land around, it's my land, and all the people who are living on the land are my farmers and my etc. So that is their history. The bourgeoisie had virtually no history, so they had to find their history. And that is when historicism came in the game. And historicism meant searching for the past, searching for what we bourgeois, what we burghers have done ourselves. And by doing so, they researched music of the Renaissance, the music even later on of the Middle Ages, and went further and further and broader and broader. But they needed, of course, musicians to perform them. And in the beginning, you all remember that Mendelssohn was the very first who brought St. Matthew Passion again in front of a general audience. The piece was of course known by everyone who was a specialist or a composer or a theory professor, but it was not known to a general audience. And Mendelssohn did it with a large choir and a nice orchestra. He got rid of the harpsichord and all those dry stuff of the Baroque and filled it in with wind instruments and made it palpable for an audience in his days. Later on, they said, yes, but is that the way it was done? And then in the second half of the 19th century, in Germany came another movement, which is called Sicilian Ism. And the Sicilian Ism was a Roman Catholic movement which tried to bring back, supported by the Church of Rome, the old 16th century Renaissance music as the example also for young composers to compose for the Roman Catholic service. By doing so, they really researched the music by Lassus, by Palestrina, by Josquin des Prez, and all the other Renaissance composers, who were then called the Netherlands School, the Netherlandish School, which is completely wrong since they had virtually nothing to do with the Netherlands, but they were what we call French, Flemish, Walloon, Northern France. A few of them were Dutch, a few of them were Italian, but it was certainly not the Netherlandish School. Nevertheless, they looked for ensembles to perform it. And that is the first time that there was, next to those large choirs, a new movement coming up with small choirs. Mostly between 16 and 24 singers to perform Palestrina and Lassus, to do it with what they then called a small soloist ensemble. And that movement, that historical movement, is still today the historical movement we have. Of course, it changed, and we have now famous names like Gardiner and others, and they work with other kind of choirs, and they work with other kind of technique and other kind of performance ideas, but each time invented its own view on the past. And I'm quite certain in the future, other musicologists and other conductors and other researchers will find other solutions for the same music as we do now. So which means every time has its own idea of the past and will make the past to his own ideas. But the changes, chamber choirs became, next to the big Philharmonic choirs, a status aparte, a special occasion for old music. And once in a while, even a modern composer would try his hand to write for such an ensemble. Debussy, for example, or Ravel. And in Germany, there were also some of them who really tried the smaller. But next to it still, Richard Strauss wrote for huge symphonic choirs. Elgar wrote for huge symphonic choirs. Some of the pieces can be very well sung by 20 or 24. No one denies it. But that was not part of his ear. His inner ear was large, with organ, the masses. And that, in fact, that change into chamber choirs became the main source for a lot of contemporary music in the latter 20th century. After the Second World War, you see that composers wanted to break completely with the past. They thought that the past led to the war. They thought that everything emotional, all that music which was so overly dramatic, emotional, even political, should just be put aside, and you have to write a purely intelligent, mathematical, computerized or matrix system music for the simple reason, if you block out your ego, then in that sense, a second, or in that even a third world war would not happen. So it was an idea, it was a dream, but it was an important one, since then they started to search what to do with such a choir. How to deal with a choir which by nature is always singing words, and most of these words have a meaning, and they convey love, they convey philosophical ideas, they convey the countryside, they do everything which is part of emotion. In fact, the voice itself is very emotional, since it is part of our body. It's the single instrument which is part of us. Everything else is an intermediary of wood or iron or bronze or whatever, but it is not us. So we have to deal with the choir in a different way. The first composer who really dealt with that was Olivier Messiaen. Olivier Messiaen was a French composer who lived up till the 1990s, he in fact inspired many young composers that it is very well possible to use the choir as any instrumental ensemble, to look into it from a completely different perspective. And quite soon after that, the idea of what they call the orchestre vocal, a vocal orchestra, since that's what they called it in those days, became part of the culture of chamber choirs. And not only in France, since Messiaen taught also in Germany, and he came to everywhere in Europe to festivals and projects, and very slowly you see that everywhere these kind of ideas were proclaimed as being a better solution for choral music. And in fact, not long after that, this was 1949, 1950, 10 years later, 1960, a German composer called Dr Schnebel wrote a piece which he calls Maulwerke, which means the works of the mouse. And what he does in this score is, in fact, try to make the sounds which the voice can make. All these kind of sounds, and find a way to notate them properly in such a way that you can really, with your mouse, the maul, have all kind of vocal works and make a score out of it. So like Messiaen, what you hear is mixed with normal singing kind of sounds, is whispering or wind sounds. That way it makes a kind of an acoustic surrounding of the music. It was much loved in those days in avant-garde scenes. But we have to realize that most of these chamber choirs, which were founded after the Second World War, were chamber choirs in the service of radio, everywhere in Europe. So you see in Germany, whether it is the Westdeutsche Rundfunk, Stuttgart, very famous vocal ensemble, Berlin, Rias Kammerchor, very famous ensemble. In the Netherlands we had the NCRV Vocaal Ensemble, which was a Christian vocal ensemble from the Christian Broadcasting Company, which was sang predominantly avant-garde music. In France it was the Ensemble Vocal de France, which is part of the French radio. Everywhere it was part of radio broadcasting organizations. The reason was very simple. After the Second World War, the Americans decided that Europe needed a kind of an impetus against the commies, as they called it, the Russians. And so a very famous Russian-American composer called Nikolai Nabokov, who was an uncle of the famous author Vladimir Nabokov, was sent by the CIA with complete freedom and a lot of money to found in Europe festivals for avant-garde music and avant-garde art. The festivals in Berlin, the festival in Vienna, the festival in Paris, all in autumn. So the Wiener Herbst, the Berliner Herbst, and Automne de Paris. They all were founded by the Americans, they were funded by the Americans, and they were meant to show the Russians that we in the Free West can do very, very well, even without them. And so this lasted till the late 70s, and then the Americans decided to stop these kind of fundings. And you see then that a lot of those avant-garde festivals slowly diminish. They give less concerts or they completely disappear. There was another reason for that too, and that is you, the audience. The audiences in the 1960s were still looking to the sky and were loving what would happen if we would all go to the moon. And you will probably remember 1969 in the summer when the first step on the moon was made, and that we thought, well, that's part of our future. That's where the sky is not even the limit. We can go further. And then in the 1970s, we had the first enormous problems with gasoline, with oil, with everything which was energy. And we found out that, in fact, the energies which we lived on after the Second World War were more limited than we thought. And you see immediately in the politics, but also apart from the political scene in the arts, a kind of reaction. The reaction back home, back on the ground, back to the ordinary. And so what you see is suddenly that composers start to write new age music, beautiful sounds, minimal music, based on pop kind of harmonies. everything became understandable. The future was an ununderstandable domain. It was something which was so far away we could not understand it, but it was part of art and part of culture. But we wanted to go back. And you see that then from that moment on, composers start to write with ideas of melody again, of rhythm again, of harmony again. They start to write all kinds of with ideas of folk music. You see it here in Ireland, you see it in Scotland, you see it in Europe, everywhere, specifically on the outer sides of Europe. You see that folk music became extremely important. It determined more or less the identity of all the people, different people, on the borderlines of Europe, which were not directly in connection with the center of Europe. And in those days, the center of Europe was West Europe. Only after 1989, the center of Europe became the old center again, and that was the axis Berlin to the south. That was the old 19th century center of Europe, since there was 1,000 kilometers to the center and 1,000 kilometers the other way around to Moscow. And that was Europe. So, because then in those days, the surrounding countries were looking for an identity, they found the identity in tonal music, harmonic music, folk music, everything, whatever you want. And audiences slowly on started to love it. Well, this explains a little bit how musically it developed. And at the same time, you see that the chamber choirs, which were existing already, changed their repertoire with the changes of the composers. And so nowadays, we see that virtually in every country there are professional chamber choirs. There are amateur chamber choirs, there are professional philharmonic choirs, although the large choirs are either opera choirs or radio choirs. There are very, very few independent philharmonic choirs. And if you look even in the British territory, the great philharmonic choirs are predominantly amateur choirs and not professionals. If there is a professional philharmonic choir, it's mostly connected to radio. So you see a change happening in the repertoire, but the chamber choirs remain. And until today, they're still there. But something did change. In the late 1990s, early 2000, you see that most governments asked themselves whether it was worthwhile to provide subvention to these small ensembles of 24 singers, sometimes 36 singers, who generally would have an audience of 300 or 400 for a concert if they have their good days. If you compare it with symphony orchestras where 1,000 or 1,500 is the average, if you compare it to football where 20,000 or 30,000 might come. So certainly we see that everywhere in Europe, after Thatcher, that was a turning point, that after Thatcher, everywhere in Europe, numbers, large quantities, became a way of measuring whether subvention was necessary, yes or no, or useful, yes or no. And that was more or less exactly in the moment that one day I was called by a few colleagues of mine from Berlin and from Paris and said, can't we just have a talk together? But what about? Well, we are thinking of broadening our backs a little bit, becoming something together. And so together with the Rias Chamber Choir from Berlin and with Accentus in Paris, we went to Paris there from the Netherlands Chamber Choir where I was then the general manager. We went to Paris and we asked ourselves, what can we do together? And one of the things we thought, typically French, I have to say, recherche. Let's do some research. Let's find what is interesting to research and let's work on research and let's see if we can get some professors and intellectuals to help us out and they will defend our cause. Then a fourth choir in a year joined us, which was the radio choir in Riga, a marvelous chamber choir. They joined us and so we were 4. And then it took 5 years. And in those 5 years, all we did was rubbing each other's backs. Aren't we good? Aren't we the top in Europe? But we were not really doing something together in the sense, okay, we gave a festival here and there, but we were not doing anything which had a political consequence. In 2009, 2 things happened more or less at the same time. One is we had a festival in the Netherlands and we needed someone to help us out, not only on the budget, but on the whole production. That is when Babette came in. And the second thing what happened is that we got a message that the Finnish radio decided to stop with the Finnish radio chamber choir, which was a marvelous ensemble. And then we were shocked for the simple reason that we saw a sign which might happen all over Europe, that official subvention of smaller ensembles or smaller bodies would just be stopped. For the simple reason, not enough audiences, not enough recompensation, not enough financial tenure to really get something back from your investments. And countries were thinking only in terms of investments. And that was a moment that we had a talk together and we decided, let's break the whole thing open. And let's start a network all over Europe with as many chamber choirs as possible, and then see what does Europe like us to do in order to provide us money. And more or less Margella said already what it is, since that is education, that is connecting, and next to education and connecting, there is of course, with the master classes, there is the festivals, the exchange. So we do reach out, we educate, we exchange, and we connect. And by doing so, we do now at this proper moment with 19 choirs, if I'm well informed, thank you, in 15 different countries in Europe. We have, last year we had a huge year, we had 4 festivals, we had professional days, we had master classes for young composers and conductors. We have every year our Tenso Europe Chamber Choir where we educate young singers in the most difficult repertoire. And what we try to do is to spread the word. Really make chamber choir again at the center of European culture. There where it started 2000 years ago. And make young composers write for it something which is actual for now, which is important for now. And at the same time also not forgetting the past. The project we are doing now already since 2014 to 2018-19 is a project which is completely dedicated to the First World War. And I have to say in all sincerity, not per se the First World War from the British Isles and the British view on, but specifically also the remainder of Europe. Since the World War was a world war in the Baltics, it was a world war on the Balkan, it was a world war in Russia, in Poland, in Central Europe, in Southern Europe, it was everywhere. And so we have a website, we try to get and gather as much poetry and texts and diary books and everything together, and we ask all the young composers who are writing for us, you need to find a text of that period, and we are going to make that alive again by composing about it, so that it will go into the future. It won't be forgotten. And also, and that's another point, because in the days itself of the First World War, very few pieces have been written about the First World War. It was afterwards by some great British composers, a few French composers, a few Germans, but most of them in 1990 turned the switch and said, Roaring Twenties, let's have a party. So we see that the whole remembrance of the First World War in the majority of European countries was just gone. And we had to get it back. So there we tried to make Europe again and become as Tenso, as a network, an example of what Europe should be. And that is a manifold of countries, each with their own identity, each with within that identity of a country, many other identities, with respect to each of these identities, with their own way of singing, of composing, of bringing forward their ideas, but together. That is what makes the difference. And I think that at this proper moment is also necessary, since the fight against the numbers, the large quantities, the governments who are thinking in dimes and dollars and not in art and content, who are forgetting that art is probably much more important to educate young children than mathematics or geography, for the simple reason that arts make us a social behavior. It makes us what we are communicating with others, not mathematics. So also there it is important. And then music on top to end my talk, since that's something I feel extremely strong about and I try to tell it everyone. Music is the most important of all the arts within the education of young children. It is with music that the brain will learn to think in abstracts. It is with music that the brain will be able to do mathematics, philosophy, to learn languages, to be a social behavior, to be empathic to other people when you make music together, to listen to each other. One day I had in front of me not such a nice audience as you are, but I had 120 doctors, professors of medicine of a medical academy in Amsterdam. And what was the reason? They were punished by the government that they had a lousy way of communicating with each other. And they asked me to tell them how to make that better, the communication, how to deal with it. And I said, well, I have only one solution. Let's sing together. And we sang with 120 doctors, medicine specialists in a hall, and not just singing a nice piece of music, no, one tone and then a third above, and one tone and a fifth above. And it has to be pure. And I want you to listen to each other and not stop singing until we have really the purest sound possible. And one of the professors of the University of Medicine came to me and said, I have never been able to listen so well to my colleagues. Well, there you are. So maybe there is something to do for even the Chamber Choir of Ireland, and that is go around and make everyone sing. I think that's the most important thing. It makes what we are, it identifies who we are, and I think that today is the moment we should really finally stick together by singing. Thank you.